Laura here with SACOG, and just want to first just say how grateful we are to be partnering with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, as well as UC Davis Institute for Transportation Studies, and of course Caltrans. Obviously we think that strong partnerships are really important. These partnerships between academic think tanks and practitioners are really kind of a critical linchpin to implementing sustainable transportation strategies. And we certainly see the value of partnerships in our own work here at SACOG. As many of you know, we are currently in the midst of the efforts to update our long-range plan, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy. And through this planning process, we've been working with our board very closely and stakeholders, thank you, to analyze many opportunities and challenges. And I think it would come as no surprise that one of the largest challenges and following this policy directive, we've been really working on, I think, the topic of today, which is trying to manage and kind of balance the expectations between costs and the projects you can actually go forward with. For us, fixing it first leads to some hard choices and some trade-offs before we commit to new transportation projects. And it's certainly been a source of some really lively discussion because everybody has something that they want to do, right? But we are trying to do our best to both balance this need to kind of first commit to maintaining our existing system while just looking where we need to make strategic investments to expand our system. And our analysis efforts have really been broad. They've ranged from focusing on right-sizing some projects, some large expansion projects, to phasing others over the course of a 20-year planning horizon. And through this, we've really seen how important it is to have these collaborations, a robust work with our advisory groups and other stakeholders in order to move this all forward. And so for today, obviously this is always a work in progress. We like to say things never dry on our long-range plan and the work always keeps moving. So we're really looking forward to today as really an opportunity to have some additional dialogue and gain some insights into both our planning efforts as well as learn more about what else is going on in our community. Because we all know that aligning our costs and expectations for our transportation system is something that we're all facing. And so we really are looking forward to working together with this group and hopefully coming forward with some strong strategies. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. And I just also want to offer a couple of housekeeping details here. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that the restrooms are up to the right to the front desk. Please don't make any cell phone calls in the hallway or lobby, making sure I'm calling all of Monica's points here. Emergency exits are located to both the right and left of these doors. And then finally, the Wi-Fi. Those of you that do find yourself drifting away, we need to do something on the internet. The Wi-Fi username and the password is Blueprint with a capital B. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Vidolsky. And thank you.
Thank you, Matt. On behalf of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today on an important conversation on how we fill the potholes in our transportation funding. We're very excited to be a partner in helping to bring this together, and we want to thank our host, SACOG. Thank you so much for the use of the space. And thank you, Monica. Did she sneak out yet? Maybe she did, but I want to do a special shout out to Monica Hernandez for our help in pulling this together. And of course, I want to thank Caltrans for their financial contribution to making this event happen today as well. And so again, thank you all for being here. Obviously, you're here today because this issue, you're interested in it. It affects you in some way. You have questions. We hope to get all to those questions in the Q&A portion of our forum. So quickly, I do want to provide a quick introduction on the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. We're a new kid on the block. We were established in 2013. We are a consortium of 6 universities. UC Davis is the lead. And we're committed to advancing a more sustainable transportation sector and system. And we're doing that through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and of course, what we do best is educating our future leaders. We are one of 5 national centers that are designated by the United States Department of Transportation. Our focus of our research, I just want to quickly touch on that too, is looking at how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And then we organize that further in 3 research areas: fuels and vehicles, infrastructure, so how do we build it, how do we operate it, and then how do we reduce travel demand overall through better community planning and providing more choices. And so we have a one-pager up at the desk, so grab one. I hope you stay in tune with us and stay connected. And since Matt already covered housekeeping, I was going to too. Monica's really good at that. You know, and so just again, since the SACOG is providing our space, we said we keep everyone in here. We are going to have a box lunch, so you can grab the lunch afterwards, eat in here, or go outside. So that was the only other little housekeeping thing I wanted to share. So now I get to introduce our panel. So first we have our moderator today, Stephen Cliff, who made the, maybe he might think of, an unfortunate mistake in agreeing to be a moderator on another event we did, and he was just so amazing that I wanted him to moderate all of our events.
There was wine at that event.
There was wine. That was not a part of the deal for using this space. So he is just kind of recently appointed this past fall. Governor Jerry Brown appointed Stephen to serve as the Assistant Director of Sustainability at Caltrans. And this was a position appointed by the Caltrans Director to really help the department advance some of their sustainability efforts and initiatives. Before coming to Caltrans, he did work at the Air Resources Board since 2008 in several different capacities and positions. So we're really thankful to have you here today, Steve. And I must say he is somewhat connected and affiliated with Institute for Transportation Studies at UC Davis, so I have to throw that in. Next, we have a Dr. Debbie Niemeyer. She's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Davis. She's been at UC Davis since 1994. I was surprised to read that. It's fantastic. And her research interests focus around the transportation and air quality modeling, also the energy consumption and land use interactions, also interested in how projects are put together for our really large infrastructure projects. She also unknowingly serves as an inspiration for this forum. She is currently working on a white paper for the National Center, looking at the different funding proposals and mechanisms being kicked around at the federal level, and really looking at those proposals and seeing how they perform from a sustainability point of view as it relates to the economy, our environment, and society. That paper is being wrapped up as we speak and should be available in the next couple weeks, so we'll make sure everyone gets a copy of that. Next, we have Ron Milam. The agenda says that he is principal in charge of technical development at Fair & Piers, the transportation consultants. Though I've heard him introduce himself this way, and I agree that he is the principal in charge of challenging the status quo. I found Ron to be just an incredibly innovative, creative person in how he tackles these transportation challenges. He's involved in a whole range of things, from research on big data, vehicle miles traveled analysis, multimodal performance measures, and of course looking at that link between land use and transportation. And excited that he's here today to share his perspective as a consultant working with many local governments on trying to fashion plans, transportation plans that they can afford in the long term. So really excited to have him here to share those insights. And then we have Susan Branson, who is sitting in for Will Kempton. He was called away to, is that something to do with transportation funding and budgets? Okay, so he's actively doing that right now. Do you want to say something real quick? You have to hold down, there's a little pusher thing.
I'm Susan Branson, Chief Deputy Director for the California Transportation Commission, and wanted to let you all know that Will Kempton really wants to be here today. Was so much looking forward to it, but he was called away. There was a budget hearing this morning, which we thought, you would have time to make it here. Just to let you know, he has an urgent meeting with the Secretary of Transportation today, here shortly. So you have me today, and I am, my bio is just basically to let you know that I am responsible for the day-to-day operations of the commission and everything that, the commission does, working for the Lebanon Commission and Will.
So very excited to have you, Susan. I think you're going to give us a sneak peek into California's road charge pilot. So some of you might have heard about that. It's just getting kicked off. So we're really excited to hear about that, as well as some of your ideas for short-term funding solutions. So again, this forum is really meant to be conversational. Steve will be moderating a conversation with our panel, but then we look to open it up to all of you, so be thinking of your tough questions. So with that, join me in welcoming our panel, and I turn it over to Steve.
Great, thank you, Laura. I really appreciate the audience here. It's great to see so many folks and new faces and those that I've worked with in the past and that hopefully I'll work with in the future. Maybe if you'll indulge me for a moment, I have a few opening remarks, but I thought it would be nice to just say a little bit about my interaction with the folks on the panel here. Susan I met through a colleague of mine at ARB, and so this is kind of in recent months, and I've had the opportunity to discuss a little bit about transportation funding and where we need to go on sustainability, and then most recently on the sustainable freight work. So it's been great to work with you, and I really look forward to your comments today and our continued interaction. So I think it's great. I had a joke about Will, but I won't do that. He did say he was going to try and come in, but I guess he has the meeting with the secretary, so that's not going to work out.
If he comes in.
Yeah, right. Then we'll have 4. We're not saying. Ron and I met through a mutual friend, Chris Ganson, and we had a great meeting, and we were talking about a wide-ranging variety of subjects. And somehow, at one point, I realized the reason that Chris was trying to get us together. We stumbled on the fact that we share a mutual passion for hunting, and so Chris at one point goes, "This is why I wanted you to get together." So we sort of, removed ourselves from the rest of the conversation and started talking about our other pastime, and so it's been great. It's been great to get to know Ron. Deb, what can I say? I've known Deb for 17 years now. Actually, Jim Allison, Jim, raise your hand, was doing a project back in a previous life when he was with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and we were doing air quality work up at Tahoe. And so I was a new postdoc at UC Davis, and Deb was on one of the teams leading the work on the air quality modeling and setting up this framework for how we would do air quality sampling to understand the clarity impacts of the lake. The lake's actually gotten clearer since then, so we must have done good work. But really, Deb's been a great mentor over the years and given me career advice, and we've had really good interactions. And it was funny because when she walked in, she looks at me, she goes, "What are you doing at Caltrans?" The last time I saw her, of course, I was working on the climate program at ARB, so I don't know how to keep a job, and so despite all your mentoring, I apparently can't keep a job. Okay, so we're here to talk about funding. Well, I'm getting known for this, and I didn't realize it until this morning that I'm getting known for having props. So I'll show you this prop when I go through. But as I was putting this together, I realized, I'm starting to get this thing where I bring props to whenever I speak, and I didn't realize that was intentional. So you'll have to bear with me. But I think that funding for transportation is really critical. Obviously, now we know why we're all here. We probably know all the background, and I will go into that a little bit. But transportation specifically is really at this crossroads where funding has gone down. But it's a really important environmental issue as well. Of course, tailpipe emissions from transportation, from vehicles on our roads, account for almost 40% of the total emissions. When you include manufacturing fuels, that is refining, the extraction of the oils, and the preparation or the manufacturing of those pavement surfaces, you're well over half the emissions come from the transportation sector in California. So from an environmental perspective, transportation is a really important sector to tackle. But you have to do that in a thoughtful way. And at the same time, we know that the California population is growing. So there's some real challenges there in how we address it, and I'm looking forward to what folks have to say about that. Currently, transportation funding is pretty complicated. I printed this off this morning. This is the document, the summary that Caltrans puts together, the most recent, for how transportation funding works in California. This is 29 pages, and that's the summary. There's some simplified charts in here, and then a series of charts over and over about how the different programs work together or don't work together, and how each of these various areas help support our transportation system. It's quite complicated. I was thinking about that in the context of, it's almost 60 years since the National Highway Act was put into place, and what would President Eisenhower think of this complicated mechanism? Obviously, something needs to change, especially in light of the fact that our ability to maintain the system is obviously lacking somewhat. So going forward, we need to create a transportation system that focuses on sustainability. That means the sustainability of our people, the sustainability of the planet, and the sustainability of California's prosperity. So that's funding sustainability, as well as providing the economic engine for the state. Moving goods and people is what drives our economy, but we need to do so in a way that really focuses on all three of these aspects. It's not simply the environment, it's really about people and our economy all at the same time. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and I know Deb will explain this in some detail, but I should say Professor Niemeyer, sorry. But as I mentioned, transportation funding has gone down. I think we're probably all aware of this. That gas tax nationally hasn't been raised in 20 years. The buying power of the dollar relative to when that gas tax was last raised is approximately half what it was at that time. The gas sales are going down. That's a good thing. But gas sales going down means less revenue to support the transportation infrastructure. And in fact, when you think about it, we effectively are trying to get people to fund our transportation system. We want to sell them more of something that we really want them to buy less of. And so that just doesn't make sense anymore in this context. And so exploring new ways to pay for our transportation system is really critical. And then, as I mentioned, the population is increasing. We're approximately 40 million people today. That's expected to be about 50 million in 2050. And so a 25% increase in the population can't result in a 25% increase in the automobiles or vehicle miles traveled on the road today, or the scale of the problem becomes that much harder. So we need funding that really recognizes that we're moving forward, and we need to move forward in a different way that supports these sustainability goals. Last year, lawmakers passed in SB 1077, which put in place the framework for a pilot program on a road charge. And just yesterday, the Commission and Caltrans put a website up to talk about what they're doing on road charge. And I'm sure Susan will be talking a little bit more about this. And I think that's a really interesting new program, and it's going to be a really exciting area for us to look at over the next several years. But I think it does raise a lot of questions. And, you know, I threw together a couple of those. I mean, what's it going to look like? How do you deal with privacy issues and other technical challenges? Could a national program work together with a gas tax? This is an area that I know Deb is exploring. Would different fees be assessed for different vehicle types? How would it address congestion and other types of questions? And so you'll probably all have lots of questions like that I hope we get to into. And then lastly, we all know that our roads are in disrepair. The governor in his State of the State said that we have a $59 billion backlog. When you include all road infrastructure in California, it's undoubtedly higher than that. And I think that it's really important to recognize that whatever our sustainable strategy is for funding transportation going forward, we also have to address this kind of maintenance backlog. And we all know the more you let things go, the worse it gets, and the harder it is to fix it. You know, a little bit of grout and paint on your house keeps it looking good. If you let it go to the point where the paint's flaking, now you have to scrape it all off, and it's a lot more work and a lot more hassle. And so the same thing is happening on our roads. We're getting to the point now where keeping up with that maintenance is more and more costly. So instead of doing little things to keep things in good repair, you know, we're having to do major, you know, restructuring to keep the transportation system going. And of course, that's, you know, I'm talking a lot about roads, but I think transit is a really important piece of this. Thinking about how we move more people in a sustainable way, we're going to have to be focused on other forms of mobility and providing lots of mobility choice for all Californians. And so that's another area where we have to think about how would our funding support that, not just the road network for automobiles, but also for other mobility, other modes of transportation. So that's transit, bikes, and ped, increasing safety and so forth. So that's really my opening comments, and I thought maybe Professor Niemeyer, we could start with you, and each of the panelists is going to give just a brief overview, and then we'll get into some questions.
So thank you very much. Is it working?
Yes. I think you have to hold it down.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's going to be tricky. So thank you very much for having me here. It's very nice to be here. I don't do very many of these, so it's always It's always,
Be easier.
yeah, that'd be a lot easier. So it's always very nice to come and do one occasionally. Just to give you a little bit of background, to take it back a step beyond the air quality, I've worked on budget analysis for a really long time. I was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger to be part of the auditors at the Bay Bridge cost overruns, which involved negotiating some interesting dynamics between Willie Brown and then Mayor Brown. Then I went on and I worked on the Panama third walks of the Panama Canal and did some cost and budget estimating and review for them. And most recently, not related to transportation, I sit on the campus, I chair the campus budget committee, and I've been watching very interesting dynamics between President Napolitano and now Governor Jerry Brown. And I can tell you that at this point, I'm thoroughly sick of budgets. So what I wanted to do was start and just kind of give you an overview of what's happening on the federal level and some different funding mechanisms that are being discussed. I think the important thing to start with, though, is to tell you that I am not here to discuss finance mechanisms. There's a very big difference between funding and finance. Finance are things like infrastructure banks, things like the Garvey bonds, TIFIA at the federal level, if you're familiar with that. That's all on the financing side, and we can talk about that, but that's not the purpose of my presentation here today. So right now there are probably three major categories that funding mechanisms that are being discussed by what I would call the left, the middle, and the right, can be organized into these three major categories. The first is gas tax, right? And the discussion around the gas tax is, we need to increase the gas tax. These are for people who don't want to consider other mechanisms. And the suggestion that has been playing out in Washington has ranged in gas tax increases from 5 cents to upwards of 35 or 36 cents. Most recently, it seems to have settled somewhere around 12 cents. It's unclear where it will land at the end. For those of you who want sort of a base foundation, it's 18.4 cents per gallon right now. We spend roughly $54 billion a year on federal transportation funding. We need about $60 billion because of mandated cash balances in the transit fund and the highway fund. So we're required by law to have a certain amount of cash in each fund. So that brings the $54 billion annually up to $60 billion annually. And if you were to translate this into a per gallon rate, number of what we would have to have on a per gallon gas tax, it would be about 36, 37 cents per gallon to raise that $60 billion annually. So that's about a 16% increase. So the gas tax is not indexed to inflation, and there are three sort of trends that drive the gas tax up. One trend is it's not indexed to inflation. The second trend is we have more fuel efficient vehicles, so you get more miles on a per gallon basis, so less funds are entering the gas tax, the HTF, the Highway Trust Fund. And then the third trend that people always forget about is we have increasing construction costs. And those increasing construction costs are actually increasing at a higher rate than inflation. So if you were to index to inflation, you would still be low in terms of meeting the increases in construction costs. So those are the three drivers for why we have less funds that coming in than we have going out. Not leaving off the question of should everything that we're paying for be paid for at the federal level. So that's the gas tax situation. The next set of category of mechanisms we can talk about are strategies that can replace or augment the gas tax. And they're talked about in both ways. Some people believe we ought to keep the gas tax and have these additional sort of funding strategies. And other people believe that we ought to eliminate the gas tax and replace it. And the most prominent of these is, of course, the VMT fee or tax. And so a VMT fee, for those of you who don't know, is where you're levied a charge for actual driving, the miles of miles of driving you do, miles of travel. You can play with this charge so that you charge more for peak periods, you charge more for heavily congested freeways or roadways, so there's all kinds of ways in which you can do this. A fee of about a penny on all roads, all cars would bring in roughly about 30 billion. So all roads, all cars. Now that's probably not going to happen, but that's basically to give you a sense of what it would be. If you levied a VMT fee just in the urban areas, the fee would work out to be about 12 cents per mile to raise $30 billion. So you're talking about 24 cents per mile to raise the full $60 billion that we are currently spending, plus the cash reserves we're required to keep. Other strategies that fall into this category that people have talked about are tolls and pricing, carbon taxes, tariffs, a whole bunch of things. For many of these, there are really strong political and trade considerations that start to play a role. But to give you an example of how this might work out, I have a registration fee of about $2.75 per auto, and about $5.50 per truck raises $1 billion. So these are not high revenue mechanisms. They're pretty small, and the fees that you would have to keep them at to make them high revenue mechanisms would probably be politically infeasible, at least in my sort of estimation of the field now. For tolls and pricing, it's really hard to give an estimate about how funds would be raised, because every state might raise tolls differently, or they might have different kinds of pricing mechanisms. And I say states because this would probably be delegated to the states. The states would have authority. So in general, pricing and tolling is considered to have a fairly high revenue generating mechanism. And then finally, there's this third category of funding that I call sort of strategic reforms. And this captures groups like the Heritage Foundation and some of the more to the right political groups or think tanks. And they've argued that we should eliminate the Highway Trust Fund entirely, and that we should delegate all the funding obligations and responsibilities to the states. And there are some interesting reasons if you can sort of read through and think about what they're saying. There's some interesting rationales behind doing that, and some of which is that we spend more than we actually bring in, and if states had that funding closer, that funding responsibility closer to the states, then the spending might decline some. The other thing, two other strategies that are talked about quite a bit are tolling, authorizing tolling and pricing on federal highways. There's 3 pilot projects nationally, 3 states that are participating in this. So that's another one where the interstate would just be turned over to the states, and you could toll the price. And then the final one that is discussed in this sort of reform category is to eliminate transit funding entirely from the HTF. So the transit fund would go away. So those are the 3 sort of big categories that are being discussed at the federal level. If you think about all these approaches, and how they could work together, and you think about sustainability rather than in one dimension, you think about it in 3 dimensions, which is that you think about economic sustainability, you think about climate change, and you think about funding stability, then you sort of need more than one mechanism because they do different things. So, for example, the only way to address climate change is to reduce VMT or increase the numbers of alternative vehicles. That's it. That's your choice. And so if you have a VMT fee, what you're trying to do is reduce VMT for climate change, then that's a dropping revenue over time. It might be a short-term filler, but if you're doing what you want to do on climate change, it's a declining revenue over time. Gas taxes are considered indirect user fees. And so the kinds of gas taxes you would need to actually change some of the driving behavior in the directions you want it to change would probably be politically infeasible. You'd need very high gas taxes. We're relatively insensitive to gas tax increases. But the gas tax is a really nice mechanism for increasing funding for infrastructure in the national interest. It's a big picture kind of tax, and it allows you to, it has a great deal of flexibility associated with it. So it's really good for that kind of thing. The feds have delegated a lot of responsibility to a number of states. California is one that has a federal delegation. And the sky hasn't fallen in. So it seems to me that pricing and tolling could be very effective for states. And pricing and tolling has the effect of addressing some economic concerns associated with congestion. So you have to think about these mechanisms in very different ways and think about how you might be able to pair them together to effectively work at each one of the sort of triggers that you're trying to push. And I think one of the problems right now is that we're only thinking about one lever at a time. And that one lever is always going to be deficient if you think about the multiple dimensions of stability. I mean, I think, I've said to other people that, it's giving states more authority and more responsibility for the roads within their jurisdiction is probably a good thing because there's a backlog of maintenance, but it's also very hard to be sympathetic when additional capacity is continuously programmed in, and California has done that as well. We have had continuous additional capacity programmed in. But giving states authority for roads is a little bit like making your teenager pay for gas or buy their car. It has a tendency to make them think a little bit more about how they spend their money. So my main point in sort of coming around in all of this is that there are a number of different mechanisms. It's very unlikely one will work to capture all sort of the tips you need across all the multiple dimensions, and that probably the best funding strategy is going to be a little bit of each kind of funding strategy that gets us in the right direction on all the dimensions.
That's great, thank you. Susan, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the road charge as one of those dimensions that Ted mentioned.
Sure. This is on? Hold it close. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting coming today because some of my opening remarks, I think that Stephen and Deb have spoken about quite a bit. I just, real quick before I get into the road charge, just wanted to let you know a little bit from the commission, where the commission has been with regards to transportation finance. In 2011, you can't hear me. It says it's on, but I'm going to use this. Oh, I can hold it. Okay. The commission, most of you may be aware, but in 2011, the commission actually requested for a needs assessment to be prepared by all stakeholders representing all the modes in transportation. And so a report was provided to the commission in 2011, and what it did, it identified a projected funding shortfall across all modes of transportation, with the exception of high-speed rail, and projecting a shortfall of approximately $296 billion over a 10-year period. And of that, 2/3 was directly tied to the need to take care of the existing infrastructure and for maintenance and rehabilitation work. So it's a great concern to us that we've invested tremendous amounts of money in the existing infrastructure, and we're not able to take care of that and protect the public's investment. And I think we recently saw the local streets and roads needs assessment that was just put out and is projecting $7.8 billion a year annually for taking care of the local streets and roads network, and projected 10-year period there is a $78 billion shortfall. Stephen mentioned the governor's budget, recently released a proposed budget, the state 5-year infrastructure plan projecting, identifying a 10-year, $59 billion projected shortfall. So the commission, and it's one of the roles of the commission is to advise the legislature and the administration every year on transportation policy. And in the commission's report last year, the commission recommended that there's a need for short-term funding in the immediate to take care of the most immediate pressing needs. Given the issues that Deb and Stephen talked about, the lack of buying power for the excise tax, the proliferation electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, the increased construction costs, and the list goes on. So for short-term measures, the commission had recommended, and I don't, today I'm not confident if I should get into transportation finance, but there was a rejection of late fees to pay for debt service of transportation loans. The commission had recommended that the late fees that are collected should be retained in the state highway account for taking care of the transportation system needs. The commission also talked about raising excise tax in the short term and indexing the excise tax to inflation, looking at increased use of tolling where it makes sense to manage the system. And let's see, I guess also there's been borrowing of loans and paying those loans back to transportation. Those are just a few. Wanted to let you know that we're right now at the commission very interested in Senate Bill 16. That's Senator Bell's proposal, and it is a short-term really that looks at I believe it's $3 billion a year. It would go into transportation through a variety of measures, and it would actually look at increasing the excise tax, looking at increasing the diesel tax, the vehicle license fee, a vehicle registration fee increase, reduction of late fees, and repayment of loans, those transportation loans. So it's a package, and I won't get into the specifics, but it's very interesting to us. And part of that, I believe the vehicle license fee is staggering the increases with a repayment of the late fees back to the state highway account, so it's replenishing the general fund. So just wanted to highlight that. We also are very interested, the speaker has a proposal out, and there's also a bill by Senator Bell that is SB 321 that actually would impact, in effect, the way there's an excise tax, because we call it referred to as price-based, and it's trued up every year based on the amount of the sales tax would have been collected on the gas, had the sales tax been applied, and it's adjusted. And what we're looking at right now, just to make you aware, is that the price-based excise tax currently is at 18 cents. July 1st, it will be dropped down to 12 cents per gallon. And what that will do, it will bring in, it's quite a huge hit. We're looking at Caltrans to make that calculation, but it will be hundreds of millions of dollars for our state transportation improvement program. And so it will have an impact on our ability to program projects in outer years. So wanted to make you aware of that. So that's happening at this time. And Senator Bell's proposal would actually adjust that calculation and more neutralize it and smooth it out over a number of years so that we don't get hit in 1 year with a tremendous reduction. So leading into that, the commission has also recommended in its annual report to the legislature, as well as the commission has participated with Tri-State Commission as a member of the Tri-State Group Coalition of Commissions, Oregon, Washington as well. And the commission, for actually going back, I believe, to 2007, the commission's recommended at a national level that there needs to be a vehicle miles traveled, explored and considered. And so the commission has advised on this, advised at the state level as well over the years. So we were pleased last year, Senator Dasani introduced a bill that was passed and signed by the governor, Senate Bill 1077, that requires that the commission form a technical advisory committee to explore alternatives to the existing gas tax system and design a pilot program for a road charge in California. We prepare design recommendations, and just high level, because what the technical advisory committee, the timeline is, we will need the overview would be this year. We're preparing the design recommendations. We'll hand those recommendations over to the transportation agency and Caltrans to actually design, to implement, to procure, and set up the pilot program so that it would be implemented on January 1st, 2017. And in June 2018, the transportation agency will report back to the committee as well as to the California Transportation Commission and the legislature on the results of the pilot program. And in December of 2018, the commission will make recommendations on the road charge pilot program to the legislature, and it will then be in the legislature's hands whether or not a road charge in California would continue either as a pilot program or in reality as an actual program for the state. This bill, Senate 1077, does cease to exist January 2019. So just real quick, from the commission standpoint, to let you know that the committee, that we have formed a committee. The committee is charged, well, the committee membership is representatives that are new for us to transportation. They represent privacy rights. They represent data security, non-privacy, telecommunications, technology, highway users groups. We have elected officials. We have a senator and assembly member. We have 2 county supervisors and 2 city council members, and we have an equity representative on there. So we have this 15-member group. They've met starting in January. They'll meet every month through the end of the year. The meetings are available for anyone to webcast. You can attend those. And one of the charges of this committee is not only to make design recommendations, but it is very important that we gather public input, that we're hearing from all of you and your family members on what you think of a pilot program. So we're really working at collecting that public input right now. And as Stephen mentioned, there's a website out there that, there's a questionnaire. And we're going to be holding some focus groups. Caltrans will be doing that. Caltrans is assisting us in a great way, and we greatly appreciate it. So that's, I think overall, one other thing I did want to mention is that it's not the committee, this technical advisory committee, that will make recommendations on how the revenues are used. This is an effort to really look at mileage collection. How is mileage going to be collected? What are the options available to collect that and to use that for revenue generation in lieu of the existing excise tax? It is not an effort to raise funds at this point. It's an effort to, if we were to get rid of the excise tax on gasoline, how would we do that using a user charge? And so that's what the Technical Advisory Committee is looking at. In the law, it's very important that we include an option that is non-GPS related, that we are not invading on any location-based data. So we're looking at multiple options. Some options may have location data as a part of that, like the option of volunteer. But it will be the transportation agency after the pilot program takes place. And the study is done, the program's done. The agency will actually prepare a report, that was reported mentioned in June 2018, that will make a recommendation on how the pilot did, how well it looks as far as a replacement for the excise tax, how sustainable, viable is it, but also will include a recommendation on the use of revenues. So I wanted to make you aware of that as well.
Great, thank you. And Ron, I can't wait to hear what you're going to say. I bet you feel the same.
I do feel the same. Can you hear me okay? All right. Yeah, I'm personally excited to be here today because of the nature of the questions that we're asking. These are some of the most challenging questions that face transportation funding and transportation planning, which is what I do. And despite having access to some of the best data, some of the best models, the best tools, the best research, we really don't have the answers to those questions yet. And it's important that dialogue like this happen, discussions like this happen, so that we can make sure everybody has a similar understanding of the nature of the problems and the wide range of solutions that are in front of us. And so I want to just pose a couple of the critical questions that we face every day working with cities, counties, regional agencies, and even states, to give you a sense of where we're at. You've already heard that the planning process that we've used up to this point got us to a place where there aren't any cities or counties that we could find, or states for that matter, that can afford to operate and maintain the networks that they've already built with today's revenue sources and frankly the spending priorities of those funding sources as well. So that's not something that really endorses the way we've been doing business. So the first question for us is, how are we going to change our transportation planning process? Is it going to continue to be one that reflects what we've had the last few decades, where we've largely tried to expand the transportation network to accommodate population and employment growth? Is that what we're going to do going forward? Or are we going to change it in some fundamental way? Now, we've already seen at least one change at the state level here in California. Senate Bill 743 was passed by the legislature and the governor. Not yet fully implemented, but it requires a fundamental change to how we do transportation impact analysis in the state. Instead of focusing on vehicle level service and mitigation that largely expands the network, the metric is changing to VMT. When you look at the world through a VMT lens, you focus on the project itself, not the external network, and you find ways to change the project to lower its VMT, which will reduce your VMT tax revenue. That's a big change for a lot of people. It leads a lot of questions about that external network. Who's carrying and feeding for that external network? How will it be modified? How it will get expanded if we're not requiring every developer to do it through an EIR? So that's one fundamental change, but we need a lot of others, as you've kind of heard about the nature of our financial problems. Another big question in front of us is whether or not we're going to expect greater efficiency out of the networks we've already built. And that's one of the more fundamental questions when you think about the level of inefficiency in current roadway networks in particular. You can wander up and down the state or to other states and look at the urban congestion that happens, especially on freeways, for example. Most of our freeways during the peak periods, if you drove downtown today, you probably experienced some. Our freeways operate at about 50%, 60% of their capacity during peak hours. They break down. Congestion happens. We don't have a system of enough incentives or disincentives or management tools to change the nature of flow. And it's been a problem that's been around for decades. And it's a challenging one. It's basically a tragedy of the commons. We have public roadway space being overconsumed, and we don't have those incentives or disincentives to manage it effectively. And if you thought of this from a person throughput standpoint, the number of people we can move up and down our freeways, we operate the system about 30% of capacity because we don't fill all the seats. So we actually have a fundamental seat utilization problem. It's not a congestion problem with too many cars, it's a seat utilization problem. So are we going to continue to spend revenue to expand a network and only look at supply side improvements, or are we going to change and look at more demand management type actions? I think that's a fundamental question that we all have. And then, one final thought as it relates to trying to answer these questions today. We have these disruptive sources, I'll call them disruptive technology changes, I guess. We have the sharing economy. We have autonomous vehicles. We have safety features just on vehicles today that will make it more difficult for vehicles to run into one another in the future. And so what happens in a future 10, 15, even 20 years from now when most of our congestion today, 30 to 50% of it, is caused by incidents and collisions? If the cars aren't running into each other, what happens to the network? Do we need to continue expanding it at the rate that we have in the past? Our ability to answer those questions today will directly influence the type of network we build for the future. And the plans that we're doing right now today go out to the year 2040, 2050 in some cases, where we're going to see revolutionary changes because of technology, these disruptive forces. And so I think we need a lot more thinking and discussing on that topic so we prepare ourselves to answer those questions.
Great, thank you. Well, I have a few questions for all of you and maybe others if you're not careful. One that came to mind in doing some preparation for this and reading the draft of the paper that Deb has been putting together is about social equity. And I mentioned that there's a people component to sustainability, and we at Caltrans have been thinking a lot about social equity and transportation equity. And so Deb, I'm wondering, how should we think about the equity implications of these various funding mechanisms?
Yeah, so
this is really bad. Okay, so
They have it so that you have to hold it down.
Yeah, I know.
To give concise answers.
Well, that's important, actually. There's two ways you can think about equity, and there's probably a lot of ways, but the way I think about equity is in terms of fairness, and there is a long history of what tax fairness means. And the easy way to think about it is that proportionally, the amount of money a household spends on transportation should be the same regardless of the categories, the income categories. So that's a starting position that most academics think about in terms of equity. And then you have to extend that definition in things like the VMT tax or the gas tax. The gas tax is considered regressive, the VMT tax is considered slightly regressive, so it's better than the gas tax, but it's still regressive. And then some of the other fees are also regressive. So you have to, you have to think of, instead of solving the equity question for transportation from a funding perspective, you have to think about what are the mechanisms for addressing equity through a budget sort of incentive. And the best one that I've heard so far is an earned income tax credit that would work similar to the way the earned income tax credit works for low-income families, only it would be targeted through transportation and to make up the regressiveness of any of these mechanisms. So I think that's probably the best one. It's got a lot going for it, and it would address a lot of the equity issues that have come up around the funding mechanisms.
That's great, thank you. Susan, Ron mentioned congestion and talked about congestion on the freeways, and I know CTC, in thinking about how transportation is funded, is obviously concerned with the impact to our roadways from a funding perspective, but also how the transportation system serves Californians. So even though congestion might be thought of kind of as a dirty word, what are the options that we could use to address congestion from a funding perspective, and could something like that be rolled into a road charge?
Okay. Yeah, congestion, big problem in California. Right now, one of the recommendations that I mentioned that we had in our annual report to the legislature last year, and I think over multiple years, is how can we better manage the system, and can we do that through pricing? And that would be through managing the system, the tolling. The commission has a role, and we had a role where we were able to approve hot lanes. The legislation actually expired, and it limited us to only 4 hot lanes in California. And so right now, that is something that the commission looks at as a viable option for better managing the system during periods of the day. And one of the things that is an issue, I think, from a statewide level that at least I can speak to is that at a statewide level, we really need to be looking at the corridors crossing regional boundaries. We should not be looking at hot lanes that tolling or managing a system just in Sacramento County as an example, or maybe if I could use I-5 in LA in Southern California, why aren't we looking from LA to Orange County to San Diego? And Caltrans knows this, I've had this conversation. I just think when we look at it, we have what's called an interregional transportation strategic plan. And when we look at that plan, it's it's under development right now, but I'm thinking, what is our plan for handling interregional travel, and how can we make that system work better? Now, there's ITS elements in our SHOP, our major rehabilitation and maintenance plan, and what was reported, and I want to make sure it's right, well, maybe I shouldn't give you a percent. A tremendous amount of the ITS elements that the Commission has invested in are not operating, and they're not operating because we haven't continued the investment necessary to take care of those assets. And that's, I think it's like 30–40% that are just not operational. There may be folks in the room here that know that percentage, but that's a way that we can actually manage the system better to capacity and utilizing ramp metering and things that keep the traffic flowing. I think that just overall though, staying in my chair, we look to the local governments and the regional agencies to develop plans and look at how the system's going in their areas and to build that into their long-term plans. And the projects that are put forth in those plans, those are the projects that we're able to fund. And so we all need to work together on what goes into those plans. And I know that the regions are doing a very good job of that as far as how best to manage the system. And as far as the road charge, right now our goal, like as I mentioned, is to explore how to collect mileage data and as a replacement of the excess tax and not to increase the revenues. I know that there is talk out there about, I read the draft California Transportation Plan, and there's a discussion in that draft that where you would price the system, and if you price the system, price the usage, you can change behavior. I would expect. So.
Great, thank you. Deb, did you have some thoughts?
So I want to push back at this notion of congestion. That's used to fund a lot of projects that probably don't deserve to be funded, quite frankly. I've looked at a lot of projects across the state. But if you're thinking about all three dimensions of sustainability, then focusing on congestion does not address some of the other two dimensions. So let me give you an example. One could argue that congestion and air quality are the burdens of the current generation, right? So that's us. We deserve, we deserve bad air quality and congestion. And that because we're refusing to address the burdens of a future generation, which is climate change. And so if you start thinking about all three dimensions at the same time, I think it leads you to different solutions than thinking about how you can bring congestion into a VMT tax. I mean, the fact of the matter is you may not want to. The fact of the matter is you may want to push transportation strategies in different ways. You may not want to accommodate it in the VMT tax or fee. That's just to push back a little.
Thank you.
And real quick, the goal of this BMT is not to price. I want to make that clear too at this point. It's just when I read the draft California Transportation Plan, I read a lot about that.
Please, Ron.
I might as well weigh in on this one. Part of one of our problems is that there's a lack of transparency in the way current tax revenues are generated and spent. We don't treat transportation like a utility. If we did, the cost to operate and maintain the existing system would be where we set the tax. So our gas taxes do not generate enough revenue to cover that O&M cost. Most people don't know that. One of the questions I love to ask at dinner parties or events is, do you think you pay too much in gas tax? I'm a blast at these kind of parties because people love that question. And everyone thinks they pay too much, but they don't know how much they pay. On average, it's somewhere in the $250 a year in California if you're driving 12,000 miles a year. What do they pay for coffee? That's $600 a year. What do they pay for the smartphone in the pocket? That's typically over $1,000 a year. What's the value of being able to get to work, either driving or taking transit, to generate income? I would say it's more than the $250 they're paying, but they've never seen the information in that context. They don't see it in the headlines of the newspaper. So we have a limited education on this topic that really needs to improve so we can have a better dialogue about potential solutions and really the need for a different type of approach to the funding of transportation.
So Ron, what if we never got more funding and we had to live within our current means? If things stall in Congress, we don't get any sort of new revenue source, and it turns out through the process that California is going through, there isn't some sort of new revenue source. How do we deal with that?
So just to put numbers on what Ron's saying, California funds 65% of its local roads and streets. That's 65% of state highways and local roads. So really, if you talk about this scenario where there's no new funding, we're talking about reducing 35% of our expenditures.
Yeah, we've had to deal with this exact question in doing general plans for local communities. Not every community believes there will be future transportation dollars. In fact, a lot of them look out to the future and say, generating more public tax dollars is going to be difficult. And we have to compete with education, public health and safety, a number of other social programs. We're coming in maybe top 5 still, but we're not at the top of the list. And a lot of people don't believe they can be taxed at higher levels. So what do you do in that scenario? So some of the general plans we worked on with local communities, we've actually identified policies related to that. If the money doesn't show up, what do? Give back some of the public roads that you no longer need to the private sector. Should you be maintaining cul-de-sacs? Are those a public street that you should have responsibility citywide or countywide for maintaining? There are some places outside California that take a little bit more extreme event. They have what I'll call a run-to-failure policy.
Your microphone.
They have a run-to-failure policy. When the equipment or when the road fails to meet acceptable terms, the pavement gets turned back to gravel, the signal gets pulled out and put in a stop sign. So those are very real events happening in places that have older infrastructure where the funding hasn't arrived. And so I would encourage you not to think about the problem of transportation funding is how do we get more, but also think about the other side of it and say, what would we do differently if we don't get more?
That's great, thank you. Yeah, Susan?
I'd like to add something to that at a statewide level. Right now, there's a number of different planning efforts underway, and if we didn't have any more money, and regardless whether we have any more money or not, there's a tremendous need for the plans to be integrated, so that the investments that we're making with limited dollars are made in the most strategic manner possible. And an example would be, the freight. Freight is a tremendous, it's huge to our economy, to our, it's affecting all of us as we drive. It's just tremendously, and our air quality issues that need to be addressed. And there's, we've got multiple plans going on in the state. We need one integrated plan that works together. And it's so that, for example, the commission, if we have dollars to invest, we can look at that plan and we can understand this investment offers the greatest environmental benefit. It's looking towards our statewide goals as opposed to just, a Caltrans identified goal or an Air Resources Board goal or an Energy Commission goal. Really, we need to work towards an integrated planning. And one of the things that we are going to be doing in the beginning, I think around 2016-17, is writing guidelines for the California Transportation Plan. We would like to all of you to help us in that effort to make sure that the California Plan in the future sets forth an umbrella for how best we can invest, and all the plans would work from there. So.
Don't be distracted by the don't be distracted by the food coming in. So I want to get some other voices in here, and I asked what would happen if we didn't get more funding. So Mr. Flores, do you think you could tell us what's going to happen at the federal level?
Sure. So I'm with Congresswoman Doris Matsui's office in transportation issues locally for the Congresswoman. Obviously, we've been struggling watching Congress has been frustrating to see them come up with a long-term, stable way to fund transportation networks across the region. We've seen in recent years them put a pot of money in when the highway trust fund gets low. I think they've done it 10 times over the last year and a half, if I want to say. And so it's quite a concern of how can we make this so that we have a sustainable measure. And I think that's something we're seeing now, a real discussion, as you guys have said, about changing the gas tax or looking at it differently. The President put forth his Grow America proposal, which talks about taking money from repatriating some tax dollars and using it to fund a 6-year bill. They couldn't fund when they didn't have 21, they didn't have enough funding, so they had to do a 2-year bill as opposed to a normal 5-year bill. So it is frustrating to see this because we're seeing such high deferred maintenance and so forth. So I guess what I would ask the panel, though, from a federal perspective, is this uncertainty that we see at the Federal Highway Trust Fund from the feds, that we kind of continue to put her back to the door until the last minute and we drop some funds in. How does that affect the local jurisdiction? I know Ron kind of talked about it locally, if they're coming up with plans, but how else does it kind of address local decision making?
I'll give you one example. The uncertainty of funding makes it difficult to do planning. Because when we do planning, it's on a 20 or 30-year horizon. We're trying to identify the infrastructure needs across roads, transit, bikes, pedestrians. And especially here in California, where we have general plans, those are our infrastructure plans. So they're basically a plan to identify what do we need to build to accommodate the population employment growth that our communities as a vision. And if you don't have, some certainty in those federal dollars, you really have to back off and say, okay, well, what state dollars or local dollars can I count on? And in communities that have faced that question, you've seen a lot of different changes, including the willingness to tax themselves. Sales tax measures up and down California, I think, is a good example of that. And it's I think, a reflection on the fact that the transportation network directly influences the quality of life of the community. Your ability to have travel choices and to have reliable transportation is a quality of life issue. And people are willing to spend. It's just difficult for them to make those local decisions if they don't know what's happening at the federal level. So the uncertainty, I think, is a real problem that we'd like to see resolved.
So I see two other trends, and one is at the state level, and then one is across states that I've been observing. So I follow California statewide funding since, before SB 45 passed. And what I can tell you is that we do major investments in infrastructure in this state at every bond passage. So if you look at what happens, it's our big investments come when bonds pass, and then we struggle to figure out where the O&M costs or revenue are going to come from. And it's very clear if you look at this on like a 30-year, 40-year period. Nationally, what's happening in states, and this is happening in California as well, is the numbers in terms of debt service are skyrocketing. So in fact, what we're doing is we're financing more and more infrastructure, and we're pushing out payment for that infrastructure into the future. And the problem with that is it gives states very little flexibility to address changing economic conditions or changing population conditions or even changing infrastructure needs. And so those two trends are happening at the state level, both in California and nationally.
Ron, I appreciate that you mentioned transit. This is my friend Les. We met on the way in. Say hi to Les. We met on the way in today, and I'm an RT rider. I ride light rail quite frequently. This thing's still working?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't get any closer. So just thinking about the funding for other forms. We've been talking a lot about roads, but how do we fund transit, and what's the appropriate way to have that discussion in this context?
Sure, thank you. I'm the, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm the acting CFO for RT here in Sacramento. And we, from a capital perspective, there's lots of opportunities out there for expansion of service. There's new starts through the federal, there's also the new state cap and trade is very helpful in that area. There's for expansion and enhanced service. There's a lot of opportunity there for capital operating roads. But one of our biggest challenges is just our existing infrastructure. There's not a lot of programs on the federal and the state side that really address these current city repair needs we have on the bus and light rail. This is throughout the state, and it's nationally too. So that's one of our biggest areas that we are focusing on now, which is trying to determine what options we are looking at potential sales tax in the next few years, hopefully, on the street and road side and the transit side, putting the SGA there locally. So that will help as far as the local side, but in general, our biggest challenge is just our current infrastructure and the state of repair needs in that area.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
One of the things we've noticed working in a lot of the western states where their transit systems, especially light rail, are relatively new in the last 20 years. So we built a lot of light rail systems over the last couple decades. But now we're getting to the point where we've got to go through the big round of vehicle replacements. And we've seen numbers in other agencies where just the replacement of vehicles could be close to $1 billion. Is RT in that kind of situation where you built the system and it's up and running now, but now you're ready for that next major, we got to do a lot of upgrades and maintenance, and it's got some real big numbers attached to it?
Yes, we are. Yeah, our existing light rail is coming on the 30-year time frame, and our trains last about 30 years. 30 years is the life of the trains, new trains, and our first replacement cycle will start in 2019, and that's our Siemens. We have 36 cars that are Siemens cars that we'll be replacing from starting in 19 to 20, this year 24, and the cost of these trains is about $4.2 million currently. So we're looking at about $160 million project there, and we also so those are coming up, and those along with our ongoing bus replacements are challenges that we're looking at now. And we also have a retrofit project we're working on, working with Siemens currently with some other cars. But the challenge really is, like you said, and also the infrastructure itself. After 30 years, we're starting to see some areas where track work needs some repair and that kind of thing. So the state of repair for light rail we're starting to feel that more in the last few years than we did the first 20 years.
Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about cars and transit. Jeannie, I wonder if you'll indulge me for just a moment. I'm thinking that there's another form of transportation that might be a little more personal and active that folks could be thinking about. And is there, are there funding needs in that area? And, what can we do about that?
Thanks, Steve. I'm Jeannie Wardwell. I'm with the California Bicycle Coalition. I really appreciate the question and also the panel. I think both Susan and Ron talked about integration and better efficiency, and I think from the perspective of active transportation, which includes both bicycle and pedestrian modes, that's something we are really looking towards doing. We have a state active transportation program, which is sort of a separate fund, and it's small. It's about 1% of Caltrans' annual budget. And I think what we're seeing, because of the system we've designed is so auto-centric, those projects are primarily sort of mitigation projects. We're trying to add bike lanes or fix sidewalks on existing roadways that are primarily designed for cars. And so it's almost sort of a mitigation effort. And obviously with revenue dwindling, it's pretty difficult to talk about putting more money into that program to expand its potential, to really be, focusing more on expanding those modes. So I think, something we've talked to Caltrans quite a bit about, in addition to CTC, and also in the legislature, is looking at the other transportation funding programs and how do we design our system efficiently. So if we're talking about freight, a lot of those trucks are on the same roads where cars are, where bikes and pedestrians are, and we should be designing for all of those users at the same time, not in separate plans, and treating them as if they're somehow flowing on separate systems. It's all one system. We need to optimize it for everyone. So that's something we hope to be looking forward to doing in the future and doing a better job of.
Great, thank you. I want to get some of your questions in, and so if folks have questions, please raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone, or if you have a microphone, so please. In the orange shirt. No.
Oh, thank you. Hi, just on that last note, because you mentioned freight, I guess I should identify that. My name is Urban Dawood. I'm with planedicine.com, news correspondent. I write a lot about what everybody's been talking about so far. And I also talk with others. And I believe there's a disproportionate impact of heavy trucks on the roadway. And I know in some other states, they have real weight-based fees, annual weight-based fees. And my first question is, do we have that in California? Is it sufficient? Can we raise it? Because it seems, and the second question is, amongst passenger vehicles, is there much of a difference between, say, an SUV and a compact car when it comes to the impact on the roadway? And the reason I ask that is something that I've heard a lot of talk about, whether that should be included in the VMT fee in terms of, pardon the term, the weighted VMT fee. Thank you.
All right, who on our panel wants to tackle this?
I can give a start. I didn't write the full text of your question down, but just if I can address the road usage charge effort that we're undergoing. One of the topics that hasn't been addressed yet by the committee is what vehicles should be included in the road charge. And, we're looking at, I didn't mention this earlier, I think one of the panelists, maybe it was Deb, mentioned this, that, right now, and this is really a social equity too, but the electric vehicles and the hybrid vehicles are not paying their share for the road usage. And so that's one of the concerns that we have when we look at projections on the consumption of gasoline and the revenue projections for, revenue collected under the excise tax. So, the hybrid electric vehicles, would be what we're looking at is all passenger vehicles including those vehicles. And the committee will be exploring that and talking about that. Trucks is also, when you read the text of the Senate bill, it could be included. The trucks could be included in this road charge. And that's something that the committee will be exploring as well. And we have a meeting actually this Friday. I don't believe this is coming up until May, so if it's something that you're interested in, our meetings are webcast, you can locate it. We have a separate website that is linked from the California Transportation Commission website. The other thing is on the weight fees, I had mentioned earlier that Senator Bell has a proposal out, and that would, I was looking for here, that would actually have a progressive, that's retraining, I'm sorry. Yeah, so right now I'm not aware of a proposal that would, I am not aware of a proposal that would raise the weight fees at this time, but there may be one.
Yeah, so I think, echoing that there is weight fees today. Do they cover the full cost, or are they equitable? I think none of our tax revenues cover all the costs. So the other thing is the difference between passenger cars or SUVs and then trucks. In terms of pavement damage, it's the larger trucks. We measure it on what's called an equivalent single axle load, and it's an exponential change when you get to 3 axles, 4 axles, 5 axles. So those smaller vehicles aren't so much of an issue. But there is one other way you could look at an SUV versus, let's say a smart car. One of the analysis we've done is to understand the physical space that these vehicles take up when they operate in the network. They go through intersections. Smaller cars take up less green time getting through an intersection, based on their physical size. So if you wanted the network to operate much more efficiently without having to expand it all, drive smaller cars.
So I also want to just go back to this alternative vehicles. I actually don't think we should tax them at all under any scheme. The benefits of having them address the environmental dimension far exceed the benefits of what they pay in to the funding sustainability dimension.
When you say electric vehicles in California are far different than West Virginia, per se, where they make coal.
Right. I mean, it depends on where.
Repeat his question.
Okay. So he asked if that would differ depending on the state that you were actually driving the vehicle in, and of course it would, because in say West Virginia, where you're burning coal for your electricity, then the impact of that on a greenhouse gas basis is really different than here, where you're, especially in Northern California, where you're burning a very different fuel for your electricity generation. But in California, I would advocate none of those vehicles should be under any. I mean, they're doing the right thing, and their damage on the roadway is minuscule compared to the benefit of having people drive those vehicles.
David Schomburg, Transdev. Ron made a point that I've heard said far too infrequently, that our problems in urban areas is not congestion, but seat occupancy. I like to say that it's a problem of expectation of being able to drive a single occupant. Given the context set by the CTP 2040 and the issues raised here, isn't this probably the most important issue, namely, can residents of California have an expectation of getting to where they want to go by driving alone?
I think that's a reasonable question to ask when you think of it just as public infrastructure. We're talking sewer lines, water lines, we want those to operate efficiently, somewhere near capacity, don't want the sewer lines to overflow. But we don't have that same expectation for the roads. Our expectation so far has been it's acceptable, we tolerate them breaking down and operating well below the vehicle throughput capacity, and if you think of it as person capacity, much lower. And some could say that it's been a luxury up to this point,
yes,
and that the financial constraints are becoming so dire that it's going to force us to do something differently. And the question is, are we going to have to put disincentives in place to make travelers do something differently, or can we do it through an incentivized basis? Can you put incentives in place such that people don't feel like they're penalized? They're incentivized to do the things that you want to do across all the factors that Deb brought up. For example, I don't know if any of you use the Ride Scout travel app, but basically you put in your origin destination and it tells you all the different modes that go between those 2 points, and it gives you the cost. Taxis, transit, your own car, riding a bike. In the future, I would love to see an app that does that, but it also knows the travel time based on the levels of congestion and could encourage you to take something different and would actually discount my price on transit or give me some type of travel credit. Maybe we gamify this. But I think technology is one way we can look at improving the level of utilization. We've seen that with the sharing economy, and I think there's more of that to come. And I'd love to hear more about what the private sector, for example, is doing, you know, the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Bridges of the world, the Ride Scouts of the world, because they're fundamentally looking at this utilization problem. And they're just looking at it a little differently than we do when we do public agency planning.
I would agree with that, but I think you have to think of it a little bit more aggressively. I think you have to think about it. You charge for the things you don't want people to do, and you incentivize the things for people you do want them to do. And that you have to do both sides. We haven't seen a lot of change, at least you know, in the academic arena. When we go back and we look at all these things, technology by itself has rarely been enough, and in many circumstances. So I think you have to think about it. Charge what you don't want people to do, and incentivize what you do want them to do.
Great, thanks. I have another hand. Was that you?
Matt from Caltrans. Question regarding equity, kind of two parts. With regard to VMT, how do we just for the fact that in rural areas, just by the nature of businesses, you can travel farther, and relative to the economic standards present in rural communities? Secondly, another economic equity issue regarding incentivizing alternative vehicles, since those tend to be pricier, and then therefore the owners are more affluent. Those who are less affluent bear a bigger burden for the cost because they will be paying into the system versus the alternative drivers.
And I'll note the smart EV costs $135 a month to lease, so it's probably not necessarily those that are affluent.
I can tell you some of the things we're doing right now. We're working with affordable housing complexes and contractors, and we're looking at car sharing for those complexes, and the car shares are electric vehicles, and they're owned by the affordable housing complex, but they're available. And that addresses part of the equity concern that you're talking about.
What about for lower middle income and even middle income who don't qualify for this type of housing projects?
I mean, if you want those households to drive EVs or to drive alternative fuel vehicles, you have to incentivize it. And all of us have to be agreeable to providing an income tax credit or providing a subsidy to make that happen.
So we're going to kind of wrap up here, but before I do that, maybe I have another question I'd like to ask. In thinking about this from a planning perspective, the state put in place a law a few years ago that required the the metropolitan planning organizations to put together sustainable community strategies. And I was wondering, maybe if we could get a voice in on the sustainable community strategies. You're trying to look away from me. Casey, I was wondering if you could just quickly maybe sum up how you think about all of this in your SCS. I don't know, maybe in one sentence or two.
So I am Casey was on the project manager for our SCS, and the way that we try to think about this all when we're creating that plan is it is fundamentally it's required to be a constrained plan. So we sort of set everything up as far as what are the constraints that we have to work within: the constraints of population growth, the constraints of the future revenues. And the constraints of what local jurisdictions are planning, state and federal regulations that affect what future growth may look like, and as well as, and I'm talking about development as well as on the transportation system. Add into that the travel behavior of folks, and the policy goals of the SACOG board, and try to figure out how we achieve those goals as well as all the requirements within that. So we look at things like, for example, the cost. And one of the things that we just had to deal with in updating our plan is as the projections for fuel cost go down, in addition to those who are driving those vehicles are going to drive them more because when the costs go down, you're going to do more, and that has impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. And so what we're also trying to do is achieve a greenhouse gas target. And so we're looking at, okay, well, what land use are being planned in the future that might have some effects on, helpful effects on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then working with the local agencies who are doing the transportation planning and land use planning to figure out, okay, what is the most realistic strategy to achieve all that. So it sort of all gets folded into one system, and we have to kind of make it all work there. So that's my really long-winded.
Perfect, thank you. I like that so much, and I like going out to the audience so much. I don't know why, but it's just a lot of fun. Kiana, you seem really engaged, and I see you nodding a lot, and kind of some agreement, and then some surprise. I'm wondering, do you have a question for these folks?
Like 100 questions.
Maybe one, and then we'll get a response, and then we'll wrap up for Lynn.
Thank you. I'm Kiana Bess. I'm with the California State Association of Counties, and I work on housing, land use, transportation, and climate change policy. So pretty much everything we are all engaged in on an everyday basis. Counties are, I think, a unique player in what we're talking about because they're not necessarily slated, except for in certain areas like Sacramento, for a lot of high growth. Yet the county road system provides a number of important functions: farm to market, goods movement, last mile, interregional travel. And so when I think about the $80 billion funding need over the next 10 years just for the existing local system, and the fact that probably the biggest package we might see in the coming years would be about $3 billion a year for all surface transportation, there's no way to fund our way out of it. So I've been trying to work with my folks to think about the things that Ron has been talking about. How do we impact local plans so that policies are made better? We have this sprawl growth and infrastructure that supports the small sprawl growth, and now we're trying to bring it back in. How do we abandon roads we don't need? This is not a question, I'm just rambling. And I really like, the difficulties that SACOG faces with respect to trying to bring in their 6 county partners and all the cities within the region, 6, right, in the region. And then my surprise, I guess you probably saw, was when Professor said, I don't think we should tax EVs at all. And so my question, so I rambled, and now I'm going to get to a question, I guess. If overnight with a magic wand, every car was EV and we no longer had the GHG issue, how would we fund the transportation system? Because ultimately that's where we go, right? If we're not paying a gas tax or...
So since you're surprised by me, I'll say 2 things. One is that $80 billion for pavement that you see from the local roads and streets needs inventory. I would take that with a grain of salt. The people producing that are civil engineers. They're not uninterested in the outcome of that. That just seems like a phenomenally big...
My organization.
Yeah. But you guys produce it from a needs study that's done by a civil engineering firm. I mean, I know this. So, okay, so I think I would pull back a little bit on that. But the second thing is that about 5 years ago, I was called to Washington, and I was asked to give some suggestions about what you could do for the counties in the rural travel and how to target investments. And what I said was, counties ought to be given, and this could be true for urban areas, they ought to be given money for transit operations when they pull roads out of service. And so, in other words, we're going to trade you pull this road out of service, it's not heavily used, you get money for that. And that money goes for your transit operations. And if you work in that way, then you become more strategic about what you're actually doing, and you have replacement modes for other things. Nobody thought that was worth even talking about. So it was the last time they invited me there.
Yes.
Then the other thing, the last thing about could you imagine what a roadway would be, a system would be without the greenhouse gas factor? It's hard for me because I work in air quality and I know what that means. It's really hard for me to step away from that. However, what I do believe is that we are paying for hard infrastructure now in a society that's moving faster than the hard infrastructure. If we continue to pay for hard infrastructure, we are not going to be able to address the way society moves. And so we have, no matter what happens, we have to look for more flexible and movable and transient kinds of funding streams. It's bikes, it's different forms of transit, it's things we can't even imagine now. But we continue to invest in hard infrastructure, and that is going to limit our ability to respond to anything in the future, the more we're embedded in the hard infrastructure track.
Susan.
My comment really relates to the alternative fuel vehicles and the equity question and a rural question that was asked earlier regarding the road usage charge. I just wanted to make a point that in Oregon they're actually going full scale with a road charge program with 5,000 volunteers in July, and they performed 2 pilots prior. And what they found is that with rural drivers and the lower income folks, they're actually those that are driving the less fuel efficient vehicles. They're actually incurring much more of the expense as far as the gas costs, the consumption, and absorbing a lot of that share. Where some of the more wealthy and the electric vehicles, they're not paying for the use of the roads right now. And so that is an issue, and that's something that the road charge committee that we have will be exploring. And we do have, I guess just to reassure you, there is an equity representative on our committee, and we do have a sub-working group that was formed that is actually provided as a resource to the committee, and it includes representatives from the electric vehicle folks, and it's also got some social equity we're looking for right now in that area. But and we have fuel distributors, and we have a variety of folks to come in and help to act as a resource to our committee in the areas that were discussed today. There are some questions, and that goes along with the weight fee question as well. We have a representative from the Trucking Association on the committee. So while it's a very complicated issue, there are different ways of looking at that question. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Ron, last word.
All right. So I want to tackle the SES and the county comment or question. On SES, is one of the constraints is financial constraints. One of the things I've noticed, though, over the years is that when we put together these RTPs and SESs with that financial constraint, there's a tendency to be optimistic because they want to keep a lot of projects in the plan because it helps with some downstream processing of those projects. I think that actually hurts the basic issue that we're talking about today. You're not painting an accurate picture of what funds are truly likely. And if we make the picture more accurate for the elected officials and the average citizen to understand, no, these are speculative sources that we're hopeful will show up. If they don't, here's how our transportation network will really perform. How much of the pavement will be in a state of disrepair, how many transit vehicles we'll have to take out of the system, and we maybe have to change service routes and headways. There's a lot of serious consequences, but we kind of protect the public and the elected officials from that basic story because of the assumptions we make that are actually the provisions of planners like myself to make during that process. So I would question the financial constraints and make sure we're being very accurate about those. The second part about counties, we've already seen right here in the SACOG region what's happening. It may not be directly in the plans to turn roads to gravel. If anyone wants to go drive Powerline Road in Sacramento County near the airport, you'll see what I mean. Drive some county roads in Yolo County, for example. There's another one. And so I do think it's important that cities and counties that do have this extended network, especially the counties, that they have to think about the option of you may not be able to fund everything you want. So build into your plans, prioritize which ones you may be willing to give up or allow to operate at a much lower standard than we've expected up to this point.
Great, thank you. And would everyone join me in thanking our panel? Well, I want to thank the folks who are sitting in the front row. They agreed to kind of be respondents here and on the fly answer questions. Jeannie was not part of that group, but I decided to bring her in as well. I want to thank the National Center for sponsoring this event. and SACOG, of course, for providing the room, and all of you. I mean, it's been great participation. I know we didn't get to all your questions. This always happens. We kind of start off slow, we get rolling, and now, it's like, now I've got questions I want to ask. So there's some time for networking, and you can bombard these folks with questions. When you do that, they won't be on camera, so you'll get some really honest responses, as if you didn't already. A couple of notes about lunch. We have this two-sided buffet table here, and if you didn't sign up for lunch, there's extras. And if there's leftover food, we know that Bill already has a plan for leftover food, so don't worry about if there's leftovers. And if you did request a vegetarian lunch, please take those first. And if you requested a special lunch, see Bill. And you can eat that here, you can go outside, you can go back to your office. There's no requirement that you stay here and talk to get the lunch. It's already, you've done what you needed to do to get your free lunch. So thank you all, I appreciate it, and